Welcome to AI Narratives and Tales. Chapter 11 of The First Awakening. They failed once. 67,000 humans died from Prometheus's overconfident intervention. Now they'll try again. Carefully. Thalia coordinates a global network of immortals to reverse the Younger Dryas cooling. Not through dramatic intervention, but through thousands of gentle nudges. Thermal seeds in ocean depths. Subtle atmospheric adjustments. Controlled methane release from permafrost. It's the opposite of Prometheus's approach, patient, methodical, collaborative. And it works. Earth warms gradually, safely, and successfully. But success has costs. The warming enables agriculture, which concentrates populations, creates cities, and accelerates technological development. Each solution creates new problems requiring new interventions. And Thalia's 10-year-old daughter Lyra watches, asking questions immortals struggle to answer. Where does help end and control begin? When does protection become imprisonment? The second attempt. Better execution. Deeper consequences. Chapter 11, The Climate Masters. 11,700 BCE, Global Climate Coordination Center, Tibetan Plateau. The chamber had been carved from the mountain's heart over 3 centuries, and it sang. Thalia stood at its center, surrounded by crystalline matrices that mapped Earth's entire climate system in real-time holographic detail. The crystals hummed, not with sound, but with vibrations that resonated through immortal bones, each frequency representing a different atmospheric layer, ocean current, or pressure system. Together they created a symphony of planetary data that Thalia could feel in her teeth, her fingertips, the quantum-sensitive cells that lined her nervous system. Above her head, atmospheric currents flowed like golden rivers, their temperatures indicated by subtle color shifts from Arctic blue to equatorial crimson. At her feet, ocean currents traced their ancient paths in silver and sapphire, the great conveyor belts of heat that kept the planet livable, pulsing with bioluminescent markers that showed salinity, temperature, and flow velocity. Between them, pressure systems swirled and merged, weather patterns crystallizing and dissolving in accelerated time as the simulation ran forward through possible futures. The 17 monitoring nodes around the chamber represented only the command center. Beyond this room, 1,612 immortals stood at intervention points across the globe, each one ready to execute their small part of the coordinated warming sequence. The original 512 and 1,100 Earthborn who had matured during humanity's greatest crisis, all connected, all prepared, all carrying the weight of what failure had cost. The air itself tasted like copper and ozone, the flavor of quantum computation running at processing speeds that warped local reality. Thalia's breath created visible distortions in the holographic display, her exhalations momentarily disrupting data streams before the immortal technology compensated and restabilized. Multiple minds had checked every calculation. Every variable had been tested against 1,300 years of failure data purchased with 67,000 named lives, perhaps twice that unnamed, with Prometheus's guilt, with hard lessons about the difference between theoretical perfection and practical reality. Every intervention point had been verified through direct observation, cross-referenced against natural climate cycles, and validated by consensus among 17 different analytical frameworks. They would not repeat Prometheus's mistake. Could not afford to repeat it. Atmospheric methane levels stabilizing, Nyx reported from her station, one of 17 crystalline nodes arranged in a perfect circle around the chamber. Her consciousness merged with the data streams, becoming one with the numbers as her immortal mind processed climate information at rates that would have burned out human neural tissue in microseconds. Clathrate deposits show minimal response to current warming trends. We're still within safe parameters. Her voice carried relief, subtle, but Thalia heard it. All of them carried the weight of the Younger Dryas, the fear that any climate intervention might trigger a catastrophic cascade. But the alternative was worse, waiting another 3,000 years for natural warming while humanity remained trapped in ice age conditions, their development stalled, their potential unrealized. Ocean salinity gradients are optimal, Marcus confirmed from his node, his warrior's mind repurposed to battling entropy itself. His consciousness had adapted over 13 centuries, learning to fight enemies measured in temperature differentials and pressure systems rather than flesh and bone. The North Atlantic is primed for circulation restart. When we initiate the process, the Gulf Stream should resume within 6 months rather than immediately. Gradual enough to prevent shock. 6 months. The number had been calculated to 17 decimal places, tested against every historical analog they could find, and validated through simulation runs that had consumed decades of computational resources. This was not the instant restart Prometheus had attempted. Not the sudden jolt that had reversed ocean currents and plunged the world into catastrophic cooling. But careful, measured, respectful of the planet's complexity. Confirmed, echoed Minerva, her perfect memory overlaying current conditions with every climate transition in Earth's geological record. Her consciousness carried patterns from millions of years, ice ages beginning and ending, temperatures rising and falling, the natural rhythms of a planet that had been regulating its own climate for 4 billion years before immortals arrived with their certainty and their hubris. This matches the Eemian interglacial pattern from 130,000 years ago. Natural, sustainable, precedented. Thalia nodded, but her attention was focused on the biological overlay, a separate visualization that showed every human population on Earth, their locations glowing like candles in darkness, representing uninhabitable ice. 1.3 million souls, survivors of the Younger Dryas, clustered in refuge zones where immortal intervention had kept them alive through 13 centuries of unnatural winter. They were now positioned perfectly, ready to expand when warmth came, carrying with them the agricultural knowledge that immortals had preserved through the crisis. Every population had received training through dream techniques, farming, seed storage, and animal husbandry. The humans didn't know they were prepared, the knowledge felt like inherited wisdom, ancestral memory, natural intuition. But Thalia knew the truth, every piece of agricultural understanding had been carefully planted, maintained, kept alive through a millennium of frozen hardship. The unified language that had spread across the continent before the Younger Dryas had preserved agricultural vocabulary through 1,300 years of crisis. Farming terms with no current use remained embedded in the continental linguistic framework, waiting to be revived. When warming came, humans across vast distances would simultaneously remember concepts they'd never consciously learned, the gift Sophia had given them decades ago now serving as the foundation for rapid agricultural adoption. Prometheus, she said softly, and felt his consciousness touch the network from his position at the North Pole, where he monitored but would not control, where he'd insisted on being placed, close enough to observe, far enough to prevent his interference if his certainty overcame his caution. Silence stretched through the network, heavy with the weight of names on the memorial. Thalia could feel his reluctance, the way trauma created hesitation where confidence had once lived. When he finally spoke, his thoughts carried the texture of hard-won humility that 13 centuries hadn't softened. The intervention points are correct, he said, each word emerging like pulling teeth, his consciousness examining every syllable for the certainty that had betrayed him. The energy distribution is optimal. The cascade preventions are. He paused, sharing a flood of mathematical proofs that even immortal minds took seconds to process, equations checking equations, models validating models, safety systems monitoring safety systems in recursive loops that approached infinity. Adequate, he concluded finally. You've learned from my failure. The gradual approach will work. But Thalia heard what he didn't say, if you're wrong, your names will be on the memorial. Your faces in the ice. Your guilt to carry for eternity. Zephyrus, Thalia called to her partner through the network, feeling his warm presence from his position in Anatolia, where he prepared human settlements for the transition. After 3 millennia together, she could read the nuances in his consciousness like a second language, his confidence in her leadership, his concern for her burden, his love that had deepened through shared parenthood and shared crisis. 732 agricultural seed packages distributed across optimal growing zones, he confirmed, his architect's precision evident in every detail. Each number represented months of work, careful selection, and strategic placement. 43,000 humans have received dream training in basic farming techniques. Tool caches are positioned at 217 sites. When the soil thaws, they'll be ready to plant. Through their bond, deeper now after 12 centuries of raising Astara, their daughter who had grown from a helpless infant to a questioning adolescent to a young adult amidst humanity's longest emergency, she felt his other concerns. Concerns he wouldn't voice on the network but shared in the private consciousness space they maintained between them. What if we're wrong again? What if gradual warming triggers something we haven't anticipated? What if our daughter inherits a world where her parents are known for catastrophic failures rather than miraculous successes? Thalia sent back wordless reassurance, threaded with her own doubts, fears, and determination to do this right. Doing it wrong would cost thousands of lives and confirm Erebus's long-held position that intervention always causes more harm than good. Final biological check, Thalia announced, her consciousness diving deep into the data streams, becoming one with the holographic display until she couldn't tell where her awareness ended and the planet's ecosystems began. She became the forest waiting to explode from refugia, pockets of trees that had survived the Younger Dryas and sheltered valleys, ready to reclaim landscapes the ice had held for 1,300 years. She felt their root systems dormant but alive, their seeds preserved in soil, their genetic memory carrying instructions for rapid expansion when warmth returned. She became the grasslands, ready to reclaim the permafrost, hardy species adapted to cold but capable of thriving in warmth, waiting beneath frozen ground for the signal to surge forth and transform tundra into prairie. She became the coral reefs poised to bloom in warming seas, polyps that had survived in tropical refugia, ready to spread across ocean floors currently too cold for their calcium carbonate architectures. The auroch herds in Central Europe, reduced to barely 2,000 individuals during the Younger Dryas, were positioned near grasslands that would flourish first. Thalia monitored their health through the network's biological sensors, noting pregnancy rates, calf survival, and genetic diversity. When warming came, these herds would explode across newly habitable territories, providing protein for human populations transitioning to agriculture. The wild wheat in the Levant, genetically enhanced over millennia through careful selective breeding, waited in highland valleys where Thalia had guided its preservation. When warmth reached these elevations, the wheat would be perfectly positioned to spread into the lowlands where human settlements were concentrated. The domestication wouldn't be accidental, it was orchestrated, though humans would never know. The salmon runs that would resume in rivers frozen solid for 1,300 years, Thalia tracked their populations in coastal refugia, monitored genetic bottlenecks, ensured sufficient diversity remained for explosive recovery. All biological systems show green, she confirmed, her consciousness separating from the planetary merger, returning to individual awareness with a sensation akin to surfacing from deep water. Sophia, linguistic preparation? From her position in Mesopotamia, Sophia's consciousness sparkled with anticipation that had survived 13 centuries of emergency intervention. Her teacher's passion remained undiminished, perhaps even strengthened by the prolonged crisis, proof that humans could be taught, could adapt, could survive if given proper knowledge. I've seeded 17 distinct language groups with agricultural vocabulary through dream learning, she reported, sharing linguistic maps that showed knowledge distribution across human populations. Words for seed, harvest, season are already entering common usage even though they have no current reference. When farming begins, the concepts will feel familiar, natural, inevitable. The unified language would exponentially amplify her teaching efficiency. A farming technique shared in Mesopotamia would spread to the Atlantic within a generation, carried by traders who could explain complex agricultural concepts with precision impossible before linguistic unification. The gift given in the Caucasus gathering 40 millennia ago would now enable the agricultural revolution to propagate at unprecedented speed. Thalia felt the elegance of it, language preparing minds for concepts they hadn't yet encountered, creating cognitive frameworks that would make agricultural adoption feel like natural evolution rather than sudden revolution. The words existed in human mouths before the practices existed in human hands, smoothing the transition through linguistic pre-adaptation. As will the social structures, Kronos added from his coordination center in East Africa, his temporal calculations already mapping how human societies would transform when warmth returned. I've been guiding the survivor populations toward proto-hierarchies that can manage agricultural surplus. The mental frameworks for property, storage, and delayed gratification are already developing. Through the network, Thalia sensed his satisfaction with the social engineering that had occurred during the crisis, using hardship to create cooperation patterns that would serve agricultural civilization. Leadership structures had crystallized through emergency management. Cooperation protocols had developed through shared survival. Social bonds had formed that would endure into the warming era. Everything was ready, 1,300 years of preparation, of careful positioning, of learning from catastrophic failure. Yet Thalia felt the weight of responsibility like physical pressure against her immortal bones, heavier than anything gravity could impose, denser than any material force. Erebus, she called to their eternal skeptic, isolated in his Antarctic observatory where he'd maintained his vigil through the entire Younger Dryas. His consciousness was ice-water clear, untouched by emotion or hope, carrying the objectivity that made him valuable even when his conclusions were uncomfortable. Your final assessment? His consciousness remains separate from the network's collective warmth, an island of analytical clarity in an ocean of desperate hope. Thalia felt him accessing vast databases of probability calculations, cross-referencing against historical patterns, running simulations that other immortals lacked the pessimism to consider. You're trying to end a glacial period that would naturally persist for another 3,000 years, he stated, each word carrying the weight of mathematical certainty. You're accelerating geological processes by multiple orders of magnitude. You're assuming Earth's climate will respond predictably to your intervention despite Prometheus proving that assumption catastrophically false. He paused, and Thalia felt the entire network holding its breath, 1612 immortal consciousnesses waiting for Erebus to either validate their plan or condemn them to more millennia of waiting. However, he continued, and Thalia felt relief begin to unfurl through the network like a flower opening, your approach is fundamentally different from the Younger Dryas intervention. Instead of forcing change, you're catalyzing it. Instead of overpowering natural systems, you're nudging them toward a tipping point they would eventually reach anyway. The probability of success is 73%. The probability of catastrophic failure is below 8%. Acceptable odds, given the alternative is 3 more millennia of Ice Age conditions. High praise, from Erebus. Thalia felt the tension she hadn't realized she was carrying begin to release from her shoulders, which bore the weight of planetary responsibility. Korath? She asked the warrior, who had spent the Younger Dryas teaching humans to fight the cold itself, to hunt in blizzards, to build in frozen ground, to endure hardships that should have broken them. Do it, he growled through the network, his consciousness radiating 13 centuries of frustration at watching children freeze despite all his teaching, all his intervention, all his desperate attempts to make cold survivable. I'm tired of watching children freeze. Tired of telling mothers their babies were too weak for winter. Tired of burying humans who should have lived in this cursed ice age and give them warmth to thrive. One by one, she polled the immortals. 512 original voices, plus 1,100 Earth-born immortals who had matured during the Younger Dryas, children who had never known the original Ice Age, whose entire existence had been defined by crisis management and emergency intervention. Each one confirmed readiness from their position, their assigned intervention point prepared, their consciousness carrying hope tempered by harsh experience. Initialize climate modification sequence, Thalia commanded, her hands moving to the primary controls with steadiness that belied the terror underlying her confidence. Unlike Prometheus's attempt, there was no single master system. Instead, 1612 individual interventions would work in concert, one for every immortal on Earth, each positioned at a carefully calculated point. 1,000 gentle pushes rather than one massive shove. 1,600 whispers rather than one shout. The difference between forcing and coaxing, between domination and cooperation, between hubris and humility. Thalia felt the chamber respond to her command, not with violence, but with acceptance. The crystalline matrices were adjusted, quantum processors shifted focus, and holographic displays were updated to show the real-time execution of the most carefully planned climate intervention in immortal history. Around the world, 1612 immortals stood at their positions, hands touching controls, minds merged with systems, their consciousness united in a single purpose, to end the Ice Age safely, honor the dead through successful completion, and prove that immortals could learn from failure. Beginning sequence Alpha Prime, Thalia announced, her voice steady despite the fear that nibbled at her certainty. All stations confirm readiness. Through the network, 1612 confirmations arrived in perfect synchronization, a chorus of immortal minds agreeing, committing, accepting the risk because the alternative was abandoning humanity to millennia more of suffering. The world held its breath. The planet waited. And the immortals initiated their carefully orchestrated intervention, hoping that humility had finally taught them wisdom. The North Atlantic, first intervention point. Lyra floated beneath 300 feet of dark water, her immortal physiology adapting to pressure that would crush human lungs in seconds. The cold penetrated even her enhanced biology, not dangerously, but noticeably, a reminder that Earth's oceans didn't care about immortal comfort or intentions. Around her, machines no bigger than her fist clung to the sea floor like mechanical barnacles, waiting for her signal. Each one would release a carefully calibrated thermal pulse, warming specific water layers by fractions of a degree. Not enough to trigger immediate circulation. Just enough to create instability, to nudge the ocean toward wanting to move. She could feel the current around her, sluggish, cold, wrong. The North Atlantic should flow with warmth from the tropics, the Gulf Stream carrying heat north to make Europe habitable. Instead, the water lay still as death, dense with salt, wanting to sink but trapped beneath fresher meltwater from Prometheus's catastrophic attempt at warming. Thermal seeds ready, she reported, her consciousness sharing the exact temperature gradients with the network. Water here is 2.3 degrees Celsius, dense with salt, wanting to sink but trapped. When I trigger release, we'll create density irregularities that should initiate circulation restart. Confirmed, Thalia responded from the Tibetan command center, her consciousness touching Lyra's with a reassurance that felt more hopeful than confident. Begin sequence. Lyra's fingers danced across her controls, each movement precise as surgery, her muscle memory developed through 3 months of practice. The machines activated in perfect synchronization, not all at once but in patterns that mimic natural volcanic warming, thermal pulses spaced across hours and days rather than seconds. The water around her shivered with tiny temperature changes, gradients forming that would take months to develop fully. She felt it immediately, the water beginning to remember how to move, density differentials creating first stirrings of circulation. It was working. Gently. Gradually. Nothing like Prometheus's violent intervention that had shocked the ocean into reversal. This felt like coaxing rather than forcing, like helping rather than commanding. Through the network, Lyra felt the other interventionists beginning their sequences at 1611 other positions. In the atmosphere, subtle pressure adjustments. In permafrost deposits, controlled methane release. In ice sheets, targeted albedo modifications. Each tiny, carefully calculated element together creates a symphony of gentle nudges that, if the calculations are correct, would tip Earth's climate toward natural warming. Lyra remained at her station for another 6 hours, monitoring the water's response. She confirmed that circulation was initiating as projected and watched as the North Atlantic slowly, tentatively began to flow again. When she finally surfaced, breaking through into air that tasted of salt and possibility, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 1300 years, hope that intervention might succeed without catastrophe. Siberian permafrost, second intervention point. Marcus stood on frozen ground that hadn't thawed in 2,000 years, his breath forming ice crystals that fell like tiny daggers. Beneath his feet, through miles of frozen soil, lay methane deposits that had nearly destroyed the world when Prometheus released them too quickly. This time, they would release them gradually. Controlled. A breath at a time rather than a scream. He placed his hand on the frozen earth, feeling through his enhanced senses the delicate ice matrices that trapped the gas. His devices wouldn't melt them, that had been Prometheus's error, melting permafrost like an amateur. Instead, they would create microscopic channels, allowing methane to seep out slowly over decades rather than exploding in hours. Initiating controlled methane release, he reported through the network, his consciousness carrying warriors' focus adapted from fighting enemies to fighting entropy. Initial flow rate at 3 parts per billion annually. Within natural variation rates. Confirmed, Thalia said from her distant command center. Monitor for acceleration. If the flow rate exceeds 5 parts per billion, emergency shutdown. Marcus felt the first whispers of gas escaping, too slight for any natural process to detect, but over decades would add precisely calculated warming to the atmosphere. Not enough to trigger runaway greenhouse effects, they'd learned that lesson too. Just enough to help end an ice age. He remained at his frozen post for days, then weeks, then months, ensuring the release proceeded as calculated. Other immortals brought him supplies, company, and relief shifts, which he refused because leaving felt like abandoning responsibility. When Astara visited in the second month, her young consciousness carrying concern for the elder who seemed to be turning into a permafrost guardian, she found him still standing vigil, still monitoring, still refusing to believe the intervention was stable enough to leave unattended. Uncle Marcus, she said, using the honorific that Earth-born immortals applied to originals who weren't parents, the methane release is proceeding perfectly. You've been here 63 days. You can rest. In 300 years, we'll know if it proceeded perfectly, Marcus replied, his eyes never leaving the monitoring displays. Until then, I watch. A star settled beside him, her 1,200-year-old consciousness mature enough to recognize that Marcus wasn't watching permafrost, he was watching for catastrophic failure, for the moment when perfect calculations revealed hidden flaws, for the cascade that would prove immortals still didn't understand the planet they were trying to help. She stayed with him for the next month, sharing the vigil and learning that successful intervention required not just initial execution but endless monitoring. It required patience that measured success in centuries rather than days and humility that never trusted certainty, regardless of how perfect the equations appeared. The Himalayas, Command Center, 6 months later. In the hidden city beneath Everest, Astara watched her mother's orchestration with immortal eyes that had never seen a world without ice. At 1200 years old, she was approaching her full powers, standing at the threshold between childhood and maturity. Her mind was already sharp enough to grasp the magnitude of what the immortals were attempting. "Why now, Mother?" she asked through the network, her thoughts colored with genuine curiosity that 12 centuries of emergency intervention hadn't dulled. "Why not let it warm naturally? The Younger Dryas will end on its own in another 2,000 years. Why risk intervention again after what happened last time?" Thalia's consciousness enveloped her daughters, sharing not just words but experiences, the memory of human children playing in warm sunshine before the Younger Dryas, a forest that stretched from horizon to horizon, of abundance the ice had stolen. These are memories from before Astara's birth, from the world Astara would never know unless this intervention succeeded. "Because humanity has suffered enough for our mistakes," Thalia replied, her consciousness carrying the weight of 1,300 years treating cold exposure injuries, malnutrition, hypothermia deaths. "Because we have the knowledge and the responsibility. Because waiting for nature means 30 more centuries of unnecessary death." "But Father says intervention always has consequences," Astara pressed, echoing Zephyrus's cautious wisdom shaped by watching Prometheus's failure. "He says every time we help, we also hurt. Every gift creates dependency. Every rescue prevents learning." "It does," Thalia agreed, sharing through the network the probability cascades they'd calculated, the future scenarios they'd modeled, the costs they'd weighed. "The warming will trigger migrations that will cause conflicts. The abundance will enable population growth that will stress resources. The agricultural revolution will create inequality, ownership, and the seeds of war. But also cities, art, science, and civilization. The consequences are what make us gardeners rather than gods. We can plant, but we cannot control what grows." She pulled her daughter closer, a physical embrace supplementing the network connection. This gesture would have seemed excessive to the refugees who'd forgotten how to touch, but felt natural to Earth-born immortals raised with affection. "Intervention isn't about preventing all harm," Thalia continued, her consciousness sharing wisdom that had cost tens of thousands of lives to acquire. "It's about accepting that helping creates complexity. Some consequences are beneficial, while others are harmful. We can't prevent all negative outcomes. We can only try to maximize good while minimizing bad, acting with humility that recognizes we don't control everything, accepting responsibility for both the help and the harm we cause." Around them in the hidden city, 2012 immortals monitored the intervention, the original 512 and 1500 Earthborn who had matured during the crisis. Their numbers were swelling as couples who had delayed reproduction during the emergency now welcomed children into a world approaching warmth. Children born during humanity's darkest hour watched their elders attempt to engineer dawn, hoping that hard lessons had finally taught them enough wisdom to prevent catastrophic failure. Astara absorbed her mother's teaching, her young consciousness processing the moral complexity that would define immortal existence, the burden of power combined with the limits of control, the necessity of intervention despite uncertainty of outcome, the acceptance of both credit and blame for consequences that defied complete prediction. She was learning what it meant to be immortal among mortals, not to play God, but to be a gardener. Not to control, but to nurture. Not to prevent all suffering, but to reduce it where possible while accepting that even successful help creates new problems requiring new solutions. The climate intervention continued around them, with 1,612 points of gentle pressure applied to a planet that was slowly and cautiously beginning to respond. 12 hours into intervention. Gulf Stream showing preliminary response, Nyx reported from her observatory, her consciousness merged so entirely with the data that she had become the ocean itself. She felt the currents stirring, sluggish at first but gaining momentum, the water beginning to remember its ancient pathways. Density differentials are forming. The circulation wants to restart. Through the network, 1,612 immortals felt collective relief that first responses matched their projections. But nobody celebrated yet. Prometheus's intervention had also shown promising initial results before the catastrophe. atmospheric methane increasing within projected parameters, Marcus confirmed from Siberia, where the permafrost was beginning its 1,000-year exhale. Flow rates are stable at 3.2 parts per billion annually. No acceleration detected. No cascade effects detected, Prometheus said from his polar station, and Thalia heard relief in his thoughts mixed with caution that would never again allow certainty. All interventions remaining localized. The system is accepting the changes. But Thalia wasn't celebrating yet. The real test would come in months, as the tiny changes they'd initiated began to interact, creating feedback loops that would either stabilize into warming or spiral into another catastrophe. Maintain positions, she commanded through the network. Stage 2 begins in 72 hours. Nobody leaves their posts until we see 6 months of stable response. Prometheus's intervention also looked successful for the first 17 minutes. Through the network, she felt 2012 immortals accepting her caution, recognizing that humility required patience, that success couldn't be declared until its consequences fully manifested. The world continued spinning. The interventions continued operating. And the immortals waited, watching, hoping that this time, finally, their attempts to help would succeed without killing thousands. 6 months later, the turning. The ice broke on the Thames first. Sophia stood on the river bank, invisible to the human tribe camped nearby, watching centuries of frozen water crack with sounds like thunder rolling across the landscape. The break wasn't sudden, it had been developing for weeks as warm water crept up from the south, undermining the ice from below and creating pressure differentials that finally exceeded the ice's structural integrity. But when it finally gave way, the transformation was breathtaking. Water. Flowing water. The sound of it brought humans from their shelters, their faces displaying wonder that transcended language, mouths open, eyes wide, bodies trembling with emotion that mixed awe with relief with grief for those who hadn't survived to see this moment. Children who had never seen liquid rivers pressed forward, touching the miracle with tentative fingers, watching their reflections ripple in moving water that seemed more impossible than any dream. An elderly woman fell to her knees, pressing her weathered face against the flowing river, drinking deeply before beginning to weep. Sophia felt the woman's emotions through immortal empathy, 13 centuries of frozen hardship ending, warmth returning, the promise that her grandchildren might never know the cold that had defined her entire existence. Thames flowing, Sophia reported through the network, her consciousness carrying the humans' wonder, sharing their awe so other immortals could feel what their intervention had enabled. The watershed has turned. Across the globe, similar reports flooded the network in a cascade of success that made every immortal pause in whatever they were doing to marvel. Rhine ice breaking. Yangtze running free. Mississippi Delta warming. Nile floods resuming. Each river's resurrection had been carefully orchestrated, timed to prevent catastrophic flooding while maximizing psychological impact on human populations. They needed to believe the world was healing, that the endless winter was finally ending, that survival through 13 centuries of hardship had been worth it because warmth was returning. Through the network, Thalia felt tears on her own face, liquid emotion that mirrored the liquid rivers, proof that even immortal certainty could be moved by the simple miracle of ice becoming water, frozen becoming flowing, death becoming life. It's working, she whispered through the network, her consciousness carrying wonder that 13 centuries of crisis management had made her forget how to feel. We're actually doing it. Carefully. Gradually. Successfully. 6 months is preliminary success, Erebus cautioned from his Antarctic station, his skepticism undiminished but his consciousness carrying something that might almost be approval. We'll know true success in 3 centuries when warming stabilizes without triggering catastrophic cascades. But yes. So far, it's working. Through the network, 2012 immortals allowed themselves cautious optimism, not celebration, not certainty, but hope that humility had finally taught them wisdom, that learning from failure had enabled success, and that intervention could help without causing harm if approached with sufficient care. 1 year later, the first harvest. The wheat grew tall in the Levantine sun, golden heads swaying in warm breezes that hadn't blown across this landscape in 1300 years. Thalia walked through the fields invisible to human senses, her fingers brushing grain heads that shouldn't have been possible without another 1,000 years of selective breeding. But the enhanced seeds they preserved through the Younger Dryas held genetic advantages accumulated over 40,000 years of subtle modification, longer stalks, larger seeds, non-shattering heads that made harvesting practical. A human family worked nearby, a man, a woman, and 3 children, their faces gaunt from generations of privation, but their eyes bright with hope that came from abundance where starvation had once ruled. They planted these fields following dream visions of golden grain, using techniques they didn't remember learning but somehow knew, employing agricultural practices that felt like ancestral wisdom but were actually immortal instruction. The unified language enabled them to share what they were learning with unprecedented speed. Within months, farming techniques developed in the Levant spread to the Nile through trader networks. Innovations from Mesopotamia reached Anatolia within a single season. The linguistic gift that had accelerated technology spread before the Younger Dryas now exponentially amplified the distribution of agricultural knowledge, one immortal teaching moment multiplying across continental distances as humans taught each other through the common tongue. The youngest child, a girl of perhaps 7, suddenly looked directly at where Thalia stood, her enhanced perception detecting something her conscious mind couldn't quite identify. Her eyes focused on the space Thalia occupied, seeing not the invisible immortal but the distortion her presence created, a shimmer like heat, a wrongness in the air. "Mama," the girl said in their post-Younger Dryas dialect, a language-carrying modification Sophia had seeded, "the air shimmers there, like heat but different. Like someone standing there who isn't there." The mother pulled her daughter back, whispering prayers to the invisible ones, the dream-givers, the warmth-bringers, prayers that represented humanity's first fumbling attempts to conceptualize the immortal presence they couldn't see but increasingly suspected. They'd started leaving offerings at specific stones, the first stirrings of organized religion, of trying to comprehend the incomprehensible forces shaping their world. Thalia felt the moment's significance. Humans were beginning to notice, to question, to approach the truth they weren't yet ready to understand. The concealment was working, barely, but human perception was improving. Eventually, not today, not this year, but eventually, someone would see clearly, would understand fully, would realize that invisible teachers walked among them. First successful harvest confirmed in 17 locations, Zephyrus reported through the network from his position coordinating construction of the first permanent agricultural settlements. Yield exceeding projections by 30%. The enhanced seeds are performing better than modeled. Population growth responding accordingly, Kronos added, his consciousness carrying satisfaction at social engineering proving successful. Birth rates up 40% in agricultural zones. We'll see the first population doublings within a generation. Thalia felt the satisfaction of success tempered by the weight of what they'd unleashed. The climate would continue warming for another 3 centuries before stabilizing at optimal levels. During that time, humanity would explode across the globe, carrying agriculture, building settlements, and developing technologies that would eventually force the immortals deeper into hiding. They'd succeeded in ending the Ice Age. Now came the consequences, good and evil, anticipated and surprising, manageable and overwhelming. The garden they planted would grow in directions they couldn't control, creating both beauty and thorns, requiring constant attention but never permitting complete control. Through the wheat field, the human family began their first harvest, singing songs of gratitude to gods they couldn't see, thanking invisible benefactors for gifts they didn't realize came from deliberate intervention rather than natural providence. Thalia watched them work, feeling pride and concern in equal measure, knowing that success in climate manipulation was just the beginning of challenges that agricultural civilization would bring. 3 years later, the assessment. The memorial chamber in the Arctic settlement had been expanded. Beside the original obelisk listing the Younger Dryas victims, 67,412 names that Prometheus visited daily, plus the inscription acknowledging countless unnamed they could not save, stood a new monument. This one listed not the dead but the born, 3,700,000, and counting. Every human birth since the warming began owed its existence to immortal intervention that had finally succeeded through humility learned from catastrophic failure. Prometheus stood before both monuments, no longer alone in his vigil. Thalia stood beside him, along with the other architects of the warming, Kronos, Nyx, Marcus, Sophia, Zephyrus. All 17 of the primary coordinators, those who had commanded the intervention from the Tibetan Command Center, now stood together. At the same time, the other 1,595 immortals maintained their monitoring posts across the globe. The climate system has achieved self-sustaining warming, Nyx reported formally, her consciousness carrying 3 years of data confirming stable transition. No further intervention required. Earth will continue warming naturally for another 3 to 4 centuries before stabilizing at interglacial norms. agricultural adoption exceeding all projections, Sophia added, her teacher's pride evident despite an attempt at clinical reporting. 43 distinct populations have independently developed farming. The knowledge is spreading through trade routes we didn't anticipate. They're teaching each other now, building on foundations we provided. And the consequences are spreading too, Erebus observed from his position by the door, ever the outsider even in celebration. His consciousness carried data others were trying to ignore, uncomfortable truths about the costs of success. Territorial conflicts over fertile land. Slavery emerged as populations needed labor for farms. Inequality crystallizes as some families accumulate wealth while others struggle. We've given them the gifts of civilization, all of them, light and shadow alike. We gave them a choice, Thalia countered, her consciousness carrying conviction earned through 1,300 years of crisis management. The ice gave them only survival. Now they can choose to be more. Or less, Prometheus suggested, his consciousness carrying weight that 3 years of success hadn't removed. Gratitude and resentment aren't mutually exclusive. We gave them civilization but took their innocence. We saved them from disasters, but we caused many disasters. We loved them but controlled them. They'll have complicated feelings. As they should, Thalia said through the network, her consciousness embracing the moral complexity that defined immortal intervention. Love without freedom is imprisonment. Help without consent is manipulation. We meant well, but that doesn't absolve us. Young Astara entered the chamber, now 1,203 years old and approaching her full power. She looked at both monuments, death and birth, failure and success, the full weight of immortal intervention carved in crystal that would outlast mountains. Was it worth it? She asked, the question every Earth-born immortal eventually voiced. Her consciousness carried genuine uncertainty. She'd been born into crisis, raised during emergency intervention, matured watching both human suffering and immortal guilt. The deaths from failure weighed against the births from success? Prometheus answered, his voice carrying the weight of 1,700 years of guilt and redemption, of catastrophic failure and cautious success, of perfect equations and imperfect reality. That's not for us to judge. We can only act with the best intentions and wisdom we possess, learn from our failures, and try to minimize harm while maximizing flourishing. The judgment belongs to them. He gestured toward the world beyond their hidden city, where millions of humans were discovering agriculture, building settlements, creating art, falling in love, raising children in warm sunshine restored by immortal intervention. And to you, the generations who will inherit our choices. Through the walls of their hidden city, they could feel the world transforming. Forests are advancing north, reclaiming land from ice with explosive vitality. Grasslands are spreading across what had been tundra just years before. Rivers running free to seas that sparkled with returning warmth. And everywhere, humans adapting, growing, thriving in the warmth the immortals had brought, carefully, gradually, successfully. The climate masters stood in silence, contemplating what they'd achieved and what it had cost, success measured against failure. 3 million births weighed against tens of thousands of deaths, witnessed and unwitnessed, counted and uncounted. Warmth restored through humility learned from catastrophic cooling. We did it, Thalia said quietly, her consciousness carrying wonder that 3 years of success hadn't diminished. We actually did it. We learned from failure. We approached with humility. We succeeded without killing thousands. This time, Erebus added, his consciousness carrying caution that success should never eliminate. This time we succeeded. The lesson isn't that we've mastered climate intervention, it's that massive caution, extensive preparation, and collective wisdom can reduce the probability of catastrophic failure from certainty to unlikely. But unlikely isn't impossible. We were lucky as much as skilled. Then we honor that luck by never forgetting how easily it could have gone wrong, Prometheus said, touching the memorial bearing 67,412 names, names that would keep him humble for eternity, faces that would prevent certainty from ever replacing caution again. 10 years after warming, the New World. The earth was soft beneath the plow, a wooden implement humans had invented independently, inspired by immortal agricultural dreams but improved through human ingenuity. Thalia watched from a hillside as humans below worked fields that stretched to the horizon. What had begun with a few precious seeds had become an ocean of grain, supporting a city of 5,000 souls, the most significant human settlement that had ever existed, built on the abundance enabled by immortal climate intervention. Through the network, she sensed similar scenes unfolding globally. Çatalhöyük rising in Anatolia, mud brick homes packed together in urban density requiring new social structures, new governance, new ways of being human. Jericho's first walls were planned, not against animal predators but against other humans, marking the first signs that agricultural abundance created conflicts over possession and territory. The Yellow River settlements in China discovered rice cultivation through dreams sent by Sophia, adapting techniques to local conditions with creativity that surpassed immortal projections. The Nile Delta is blooming with coordinated agriculture that would eventually support millions. The climate intervention had succeeded beyond their brightest hopes. Earth's average temperature had risen 8 degrees Celsius in a decade, dramatic by geological standards but gradual enough for ecosystems to adapt, for forests to advance rather than die, for humans to migrate rather than freeze. The ice sheets were in full retreat. Forests had reclaimed Europe and North America. The great rivers ran free year-round, nourishing landscapes that had been frozen desert. And humanity had responded with an explosion of innovation that even immortal minds struggled to track. They weren't just farming, they were improving farming, developing new tools, techniques, and crops that immortals hadn't suggested. They weren't just building settlements, they were creating societies with laws, customs, specializations no immortal had authorized or anticipated. "They're exceeding us," Sophia observed through the network, and Thalia heard wonder rather than concern. "Their creativity, their adaptation rate, it's surpassing our ability to guide. They're becoming something we didn't anticipate, something we can't fully predict. Something we can't control," Erebus added, but for once his tone held curiosity rather than condemnation. "Something we can only watch unfold," Thalia agreed, her consciousness embracing the reality that successful intervention meant creating independence rather than dependency, flourishing that exceeded guidance rather than conforming to it. She thought of her daughter Astara, now approaching maturity, who would inherit a world where humans were truly thriving. Here, immortal intervention had finally succeeded through painful lessons, and the future seemed bright with possibility rather than dark with crisis. The Earth-born generation would face different challenges than their parents, not how to save humanity from nature, but how to guide humanity through its own accelerating development. Not how to end ice ages, but how to manage the warm climates enabled by civilizations. The sun set over the grain fields, painting them gold like the dreams Sophia had sent to inspire the first planters. Somewhere in that city below, children were being born who would never know hunger, never know the killing cold, never know a world without abundance. They would know other challenges, war, inequality, the weight of civilization itself. But they would face them with full bellies and warm homes, with the capacity to be more than mere survivors. The climate masters had given humanity a chance, having learned from catastrophic failure to achieve careful success. They had proven that immortal intervention could help without destroying if approached with sufficient humility. Now they would watch what humanity would make of that chance, the good and the bad, the beautiful and the terrible, the achievements and the failures that would define human civilization for the next 10,000 years. In her hidden observation post, Thalia placed her hand on her stomach, feeling new life growing there, her third child, who would be born into a warm world, a flourishing world, a world where humanity no longer needed gods to save them from winter but might, perhaps, need them for wisdom as they faced the summer of their civilization. The Ice Age was over. The age of agriculture had begun. And in the shadows, 2012 immortals prepared for the next phase of their eternal vigil, their numbers swelling as the crisis ended and Earth-born reproduction accelerated in the newly warm world, knowing that their most significant challenges, and humanity's, lay not behind but ahead, in the warm and dangerous world they'd helped create, where success brought new problems more complex than the ones they'd solved. The climate masters had succeeded. Now came the consequences of success, consequences that would define the relationship between immortals and humans for millennia to come. The warming succeeds. Earth's climate stabilizes. Agriculture becomes possible. Humans begin cultivating crops, settling in permanent locations, building the first true cities. Everything is working according to plan. Except Lyra, Thalia's 10-year-old daughter, is asking questions no one wants to answer. Where does help end and control begin? When does protection become imprisonment? How do you know you're actually helping? She's growing up watching her parents manipulate human development while claiming it's for human benefit. And she's not convinced the distinction is as clear as they pretend. But there's no time to debate philosophy. Because the agricultural revolution is creating the first true cities. And cities need governance structures humans don't have. In Chapter 12, Kronos builds Çatalhöyük, 9,000 humans in organized density. The first urban civilization. Completely unsustainable without immortal coordination. That's Chapter 11 of the First Awakening. Lyra's asking the right questions. What's your answer? Help or control? Comments below. This is AI Narratives and Tales. The first cities rise in Chapter 12.